Hello everyone, welcome to Achievers IAS classes. Let's begin our analysis on the monthly roundup where we'll discuss some of the most important events of the month gone by. So let's start with the federal issues which were in news. The first one is regarding the Supreme Court's verdict in the power struggle between the Union government and the government of the National Capital Territory of Delhi. A five-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court has unanimously held that the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi is bound by the aid and advice of the elected Delhi government. And in case of a difference of opinion, the LG should straightaway refer the dispute to the President for a final decision on the matter. It therefore concluded that governance of Delhi cannot rest upon the whims of one functionary, that is the Lieutenant Governor, because the Lieutenant Governor has not been entrusted with any independent decision making powers but has to act either on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers or he is bound to implement the decision taken by the President on a reference made by him. This is in contrast to the verdict of the Delhi High Court in 2016, which had declared that the LG had complete control of all matters regarding the National Capital Territory of Delhi, and nothing will happen without the concurrence of the LG. Further, the Supreme Court has advised both the central government and the Delhi government to show statesmanship, adopt combined action, and sincere cooperation to achieve the common objective by coining a term known as collaborative federalism. Because ultimately, it's the people who are sovereign, and the decisions of the elected government in Delhi represent the public will, perception, and popular sentiment. In this regard, the Supreme Court has observed that a legitimate decision of the Council of Ministers cannot be withheld due to the negative attitude of the Lieutenant Governor. On the question of statehood, the Supreme Court followed the 1987 Balakrishnan report to conclude that Delhi is not a state. The report had held that Delhi could not have a situation in which the national capital had two governments run by different political parties which could lead to conflicts and undermine national interest. Well, this is a landmark judgment, and terms like collaborative federalism can be straightaway picked up for a question in the examination. Therefore, please focus on such key terms. Now let's move on to the next issue. The Law Commission had held consultations with several political parties on the proposal for simultaneous elections, on which the political parties are deeply divided and many terming it as unconstitutional and impractical. The idea of simultaneous elections has obvious advantages, like there would be a drastic cut in the election expenditure, and also the governments will be able to focus more on the legislation and the governance aspect rather than having to be in the campaign mode forever. However, it has many practical difficulties also because national issues may get precedence over local issues, as well as the synchronization of the elections would involve either curtailment of the term or extension of the term of a house, the legal propriety of which is questionable. One of the solutions put forth is holding of elections for one group of states with the 2019 election, and for the rest after 2.5 years, and from there on every 30 months. Further, there is also a proposal for a constructive vote of no confidence where legislators must also propose an alternative if the ruling regime falls due to lack of majority in the House. The other recommendations include granting of a one-time waiver of the anti-defection law to enable the House to elect a leader in the event of a hung assembly, and also if a midterm election has to be held, the term of such an election would only be for the remainder of its tenure. However, it is unclear if political parties are willing to invest their time and resources in an election where they get to form the government for a reduced term. What is important is several of these reforms can be adopted even without adopting the simultaneous elections itself, and there are many pressing reforms like curbing the use of black money in elections and tackling the staggered manner in which these elections are held in many of the states. Now let's look into some of the legislative and government policy issues. The first one is the report submitted by the Law Commission which has said that it is impossible to stop illegal gambling and the only viable option left is to regulate gambling in sports. The Commission has recommended cashless gambling in sports as a means to increase revenue as well as discourage unlawful gambling. Further, it suggests that the money generated through the regulation of such activities can be used for public welfare measures for which changes under the Income Tax Act and the Goods and Services Act have to be brought in accordingly. For this to happen, it suggests that the gamblers and operators should be linked to their Aadhaar and PAN cards so that the government can track such activities and also introduce a cap on the number of gambling transactions for each individual as well as restrictions on the amount which it has recommended to be prescribed while using electronic money facilities such as credit cards, debit cards, net banking, etc. The Commission has also recommended classification of proper gambling and small gambling, where proper gambling would be for the rich who play for high stakes, while small gambling would be for the low income groups. Further, it has said that regulations should be put in place to protect the vulnerable groups, minors, and those below the poverty line who derive their sustenance from social welfare measures, subsidies, and Jandan account holders from exploitation through gambling. In order to encourage investment in the casino or online gaming industry, the Commission has recommended amendment to the Foreign Exchange Management and the Foreign Direct Investment laws as the sector has the potential to propel tourism as well as employment. However, one of the members of the Law Commission has expressed strong dissent, saying that the Law Commission's report was not comprehensive and a country as poor as India should not allow legalized gambling, which could only benefit certain vested interests who want legalization of gambling. Further, he criticized the Commission for exceeding its mandate given by the Supreme Court in 2016, which had asked the Commission to look into the question of legalizing betting in cricket but not sports as a whole. The next issue which we will discuss is the recent amendments to the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988. The law was initially promulgated in order to combat corruption, but Section 13(1)(d) of the Act was criticized, under which the public servants were culpable for securing a pecuniary advantage without any public interest. This resulted in many honest officials being prosecuted even when they gained nothing and were only exercising their power or discretion in favor of someone. Therefore, it had a chilling effect on governance and deterred bold decision making, which the recent amendments seek to address. The amendments make it more concise and restricts criminal misconduct to mainly two offences, that is, misappropriating the property entrusted to a public servant and amassing unexplained wealth. Further, it has been explained that a person shall be presumed to have intentionally enriched himself if he or she cannot account for his or her assets through known sources of income. Along with these amendments, it has made citizens liable for offering a bribe to a public servant, which is in line with the UN Convention Against Corruption, the only exception being when one is coerced to give a bribe, in which case he can report to the law enforcement authorities within a period of 7 days. However, there is no clarity on the options available to the people when the police or any other agency refuses to register a complaint. Further, the introduction of the prior approval norm to start an investigation is seen as creating another layer of protection in the initial stage of the probe itself, which is seen as undesirable by several activists. What needs to be remembered here is a public servant needs to be protected against unfair prosecution, but a genuine drive against corruption should be strengthened by creating an ombudsman in the form of a Lokpal or Lokayukta, as well as assure citizens of time bound services and whistleblower protection. In essence, there has to be a balance between protecting honest public servants and prevention of corruption. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the recently proposed amendments to the Right to Information Act. The proposed amendments shows that the central government seeks control over the tenure, salary and allowances of the chief information commissioners and the information commissioners at the center as well as the state chief information commissioners at the state level. Such a change would eliminate the parity they currently have with the chief election commissioner and the election commissioners and therefore equivalence with the judge of the Supreme Court in matters of pay, allowances and service conditions. The center will also fix the terms for the state information commissioners, which could erode the independence of the information commissions at the national and the state level. As you are aware, the Right to Information Act empowers the citizens and does away with the colonial legacy of secretive government, and hence the Supreme Court has held that the right to information is integral to the right to free expression under Article 19(1)(a). Therefore, weakening the transparency law would negate the right guaranteed under Article 19, but the central government argues that, unlike the Election Commission, information commissioners are not constitutional bodies but mere statutory creations under the law. This is a narrow view, and the government should instead look into issues like the huge number of pending appeals and complaints, the large number of vacancies in the commission which have to be filled up, the ignorance of several state departments to publish information on a proactive basis, which is a requirement under the Section 4 of the Act, and also develop a reliable online system to apply for the information. These are some of the serious lacuna which the government should address rather than any move which could deal a blow to transparency in governance. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which perhaps is the most important issue of the previous month, and that is the draft Personal Data Protection Bill. The expert panel, headed by Justice B.N. Srikrishna, has proposed that critical personal data of Indian citizens be processed in centers located within the country. As per the bill, personal data is any data of a natural person who is directly or indirectly identifiable with regard to any specific characteristic, trait, attribute or any other feature of identity of such a natural person. The committee has defined personal data in such broad terms but has left it to the government to notify categories of personal data which will be considered critical. For other personal data which are not critical, it suggests that it can be transferred outside the territory of India provided that at least one copy of the data will be stored in India. The Act will apply to all those entities carrying on business in India or other activities such as profiling, data processing, etc., which could cause privacy breach. The draft also provides for penalties for the data processor as well as the compensation to the victim for the violations of the data protection law. In this regard, it has suggested a penalty of either 15 crore rupees or 4% of the total worldwide turnover of any data collection or processing entity for violating the provisions of the bill. Further, it has added that the processing of sensitive personal data should only be on the basis of explicit consent of the data principal. The committee has also clarified that the law will not have any retrospective effect and will come into force in a structured and phased manner. On the critical issue of the right to be forgotten, which refers to the ability of the individuals to limit, delink, delete or correct the personal information on the internet that is misleading or irrelevant lies with the individual. Therefore, the bill seeks to strike a balance between the freedom of expression and the right to informational privacy, but at the same time, it has recommended that the processing of data for certain interests such as the security of the state, legal proceedings, research and journalistic purposes may be exempt from certain obligations of the proposed data protection law. On the issue of personal data of children, the committee has differentiated between two types of data processing entities The first, which provided services like YouTube, Hot Wheels, Walt Disney, and the second, which constituted the social media services such as Facebook and Instagram. The committee recommends that the Data Protection Authority will have the power to designate websites or online services that process large volumes of personal data of children as guardian data fiduciaries, thereby placing the onus of properly processing the data of a child on the company itself, which is preferable to the existing regulatory approach, which is based on the sole consent of the parent. This will go a long way in addressing various issues like behavioral monitoring, tracking, and targeted advertising, which may not be in the best interest of the child. For the implementation of the above recommendations, the committee has recommended to set up a data protection authority which will be in charge of ensuring that the data processing entities act in accordance with the law. Now let's move on to some of the issues where the judiciary was involved. The first one is regarding mob lynching. The Supreme Court has condemned the recent spate of lynchings as horrendous acts of mobocracy and told the parliament to make lynching a separate offence. The Supreme Court described lynching and mob violence as creeping threats fed by fake news and false stories which has the potential to consume the country like a typhoon-like monster. Therefore, it directed both the central and state governments to undertake several preventive, remedial, and punitive measures to deal with lynching and mob violence, saying that the government cannot allow self-styled vigilantes to take over from law enforcement agencies as the protectors of law. Even the recent incidents of lynching of various Dalits, minority community members, as well as those who were alleged to be child lifters, the recent decision of the Supreme Court is welcome, but it remains to be seen how far it will be implemented by the government. The next issue was regarding Section 377 of the IPC, which criminalizes homosexuality. The ongoing hearing in the Supreme Court indicates that there is a better appreciation of the need for equal constitutional protection to all citizens, which is different from the stance taken by the court in 2013, which had declined to strike down Section 377 as homosexuals constituted only a minuscule minority of the population. Also, the center has taken a cautious stand rather than a categorical position, thereby signaling that it is not opposed to the decriminalization of homosexuality. Although the court has said that it is now focusing only on Section 377, there are larger questions related to right to life and right to privacy of those individuals in such relationships, given the background of the right to privacy verdict delivered by the court in the Justice case Puttaswamy versus the Union of India case. The court in this case had said that the right to privacy and protection of sexual orientation lies at the heart of fundamental rights guaranteed by Article 14, 15, and 21 of the Constitution, thereby giving rise to questions on the constitutionality of Section 377 of the IPC. Obviously, there would be some reaction from the religious and conservative sections of the society on decriminalizing Section 377 as well as the demand for inheritance rights. But the urgent need is to overturn the retrograde judgment of 2013 in the Suresh Kumar Kaushal case and the rightful extension of constitutional rights to all the citizens of India. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the decision of the Supreme Court to live stream the court proceedings. A three-judge bench of the Supreme Court has said that live streaming of court proceedings is only an extension of the open court system where the public can walk in and watch court proceedings. With live streaming, litigants, law students, and public can watch them as they happen, and people from far-flung states such as Tamil Nadu and Kerala do not have to travel all the way to Delhi for just a day's hearing. The government has proposed a dedicated channel like the Rajya Sabha TV and the Lok Sabha TV for the Supreme Court and has said that live streaming would keep a check on lawyers' conduct inside the courtrooms, as there would be fewer interruptions, raised voices, and adjournments from the lawyers because the entire country would be watching them. The Attorney General has, however, expressed reservations about live streaming cases which involve national security concerns, matrimonial disputes, and rape cases because public viewing of marital dispute and rape case related proceedings would seriously affect justice and may amount to violation of the fundamental right to privacy of the persons involved. Such a system has already been put in place in countries like the UK, and it is certainly a step towards increasing transparency and accountability of the judiciary. Now let's look into some of the important issues from the General Studies Paper 3 perspective, starting with the mechanism to reduce the burden of bad loans. The Inter-Creditor Agreement is aimed at speedy resolution of non-performing loans in which loans of 50 crore and above will be taken up for resolution. According to the agreement, a lead bank with the highest exposure to a non-performing asset can come up with a resolution plan which can either be agreed to by the other lenders, and those who are unhappy can either sell off their stake or buy the stake of other lenders at a discount. This is an improvement over the earlier model which relied on the joint lenders forum to arrive at a consensus among the creditors, often resulting in a deadlock between the lenders on the ground rules of debt resolution. However, the ICA may have certain unintended consequences, like the banks may be compelled to engage in a quick fire sale of assets due to arbitrary deadlines on the resolution process, which might work against the interests of the lenders who look to get the best price for their stressed assets. Also, the biggest obstacle to bad loan resolution is the absence of buyers who can purchase the stressed assets from the banks and the unwillingness of the banks to sell their loans at a deep discount. Therefore, unless the government can solve this problem, the bad loan menace is likely to remain unresolved for some time to come. The next issue was regarding the recent hike in the minimum support prices for the kharif crops announced by the central government. The government claims that it was done to assure a price of at least 150% of the cost of production, which is in line with the farm sector strategy announced in this year's budget. And in this regard, it relied on the estimates of input costs which was actually paid by the farmers, as well as the value of unpaid family labor engaged in the field. However, the final hikes of some crops are even higher, like for example, MSP for Bajra is 97% over the estimated costs of production. On an average, the recent MSP hike is the biggest hike since 2013-14 and is seen as a much needed respite to the farmers. But with less than a year to go for the general election, the recent hike shows that the government has opted to reverse the abundant inflationary caution it had exercised previously with respect to fixing MSPs. Because when it came to power in 2014, it had advised state governments against granting any bonuses over and above the MSPs, and also the budget this year had promised that the Niti Aayog would work with the center and states to put forward a foolproof mechanism in order to ensure adequate remuneration to farmers if the market prices fall below the MSP through government purchases or through a gap funding mechanism whereby the difference between the MSPs and the market prices is transferred to the farmers. Little has been done by the government in this regard, and it remains to be seen what the impact of the recent MSP hikes would be on the consumer price inflation. In this regard, the recent MSP hikes may result in a rise in rural incomes, but reforms in the agricultural markets are vital to prevent a distortionary effect on the farmers' choices of crops based on account of MSPs. Therefore, easing the stockholding limits under the Essential Commodities Act and avoiding frequent restrictions on farm exports are some of the key reforms which could go a long way in augmenting farmers' income. On that, finally, let's move on to some of the important international news of the previous month, starting with the CATSA Act, or the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act. The act imposes sanctions on any country carrying out significant defense and energy trade with American adversaries, particularly Russia, Iran, and North Korea. India had raised its concerns over this legislation and had said that it would go ahead with the S-400 Triumph missile system deal with Russia, regardless of the US law. In this regard, recently, a US Congress's report allowing the introduction of a presidential waiver for this controversial legislation will be greeted with a sense of relief in both India and US, because not only did the US president object the CATSA Act, but also the US wants to partner with India in the Indo-Pacific, and such moves would only hamper India's military capabilities. Also, India is largely compliant with the demand made by the US that it reduce the defense relations with Russia and also strengthen the same with US. In this regard, India has significantly reduced its dependence on Russian military hardware with a proportionate increase in the defense purchases from US. Therefore, imposing sanctions on India would be unfair. In this regard, the modified waiver authority, as proposed by the Congress, will allow the President to waive off sanctions in certain circumstances for 6 months at a time, as long as he certifies that such waiver is in US's national security interests and does not endanger the ongoing operations. While this is a welcome move, there are other concerns in the bilateral relations between India and US, like the US demand to bring down the energy imports from Iran, which is currently the second largest supplier of crude oil to India. The issue might be taken up at the 2+2 dialogue, which has been scheduled in September, but India has to be aware that the waivers, if granted, would be contingent on the US President's continued support to India's defense requirements, and given the unpredictable policy swings under the current president, India should not presume that its problems over the CATSA Act have been fully addressed. The next issue in news is regarding the Prime Minister's visit to Africa, starting from Rwanda. Despite the ramping up of high-level visits to Africa in the recent past, the Indian interest in the African growth story has not kept pace and has even declined as per the World Investment Report of 2018, which highlights the FDI figures in 2016-17, which was lower than the previous years. While one of the reasons has been the investment climate in the African countries itself, but India's investments have been concentrated in the East African trade and investment opportunities, as well as dependence on petroleum and liquefied natural gas. Further, there are challenges of Chinese competition as well, therefore demanding diversification in India's approach to Africa in order to broaden the economic engagement. On that note, I'm wrapping up this session. However, there were other important issues of the month, like the debate on organ donation, the utility of entrance exams like NEET, the issue of drug menace in Punjab, and many more, which I have covered in detail in the regular analysis videos. And I request those who have missed it to go back and watch the same. I wish you all the best. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.